The Nevada sun blazed mercilessly across the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base as Sarah Chun stepped out of the shuttle bus, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder with practiced ease. At 28, she possessed an unremarkable appearance that allowed her to blend seamlessly into any crowd, medium height, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and clothes chosen for practicality rather than style. Her stride carried a subtle confidence that most people missed, the kind that came from years of moving through spaces where being noticed meant trouble. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Another civilian tech, muttered Airman Rodriguez to his partner as they processed her entry credentials at the security checkpoint. These contractor types think they can just waltz in here and understand what we do. Sarah handed over her identification without comment, accepting her temporary badge with a polite nod that revealed nothing about her thoughts. The Advanced Avionics Integration Program at Nellis was designed to familiarize civilian specialists with cutting-edge fighter aircraft systems, a 6-week intensive course that most participants found either thrilling or overwhelming. Sarah appeared to find it neither, maintaining the same calm demeanor whether reviewing classified technical specifications or observing live flight demonstrations from the ground. Her temporary quarters in the civilian contractor dormitory reflected the same practical minimalism as her appearance. A single bed with military-precise corners, a small desk occupied only by necessary paperwork, and walls bare of personal photographs or memorabilia that might suggest emotional attachments. The compact sedan she had rented at Las Vegas Airport told its own story, someone who chose reliability over impression, function over form. No aviation posters decorated her modest space. No model aircraft or pilot memorabilia cluttered her shelves. Nothing connected her to the world of flight that surrounded every aspect of life at Nellis, where the roar of fighter jets served as a constant reminder of humanity's conquest of the skies. Her apparent indifference to the spectacle that left other contractors wide-eyed with wonder struck several observers as oddly disconnected. During the first week of the program, subtle details began accumulating that didn't quite align with the straightforward picture she presented. Her posture remained perfectly erect without conscious effort, the kind of bearing that suggested extensive training rather than good intentions about maintaining proper stance. She demonstrated an unusual awareness of aircraft movements overhead, always knowing which direction the sound was coming from and often identifying aircraft types before they became visible to others. "Did you see how she handled those flight control specifications?" whispered Marcus Williams, a fellow contractor who worked for a major defense electronics company. "She understood those diagrams faster than people who've been working with this stuff for years." During technical briefings, Sarah's questions revealed depth of understanding that seemed inconsistent with someone whose official background listed only computer systems. Integration experience, her knowledge of aviation terminology, extended far beyond what someone with purely civilian experience should possess. She used phrases like angle of attack and thrust vectoring with the casual fluency of someone who had lived and breathed these concepts rather than merely studied them in technical manuals. When instructors discussed complex aerodynamic principles, her subtle nods suggested comprehension that went deeper than theoretical understanding. The way she instinctively reacted to emergency sirens and announcements spoke of training that civilian contractors rarely received. While others looked around in confusion during unexpected drills, Sarah's eyes immediately located the nearest exits and assessed potential evacuation routes with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been conditioned to think tactically. Under pressure, her hands bore small scars that became visible during equipment handling exercises, thin white lines too precise to be accidents from normal civilian work, suggesting exposure to environments where injury was an occupational hazard rather than an occasional mishap. The calluses on her palms indicated familiarity with physical demands that computer work alone could never create. "How did you know about the hydraulic backup systems?" asked Jennifer Blake, a former Navy electronics specialist who now worked in private defense contracting. "That information wasn't in any of our preliminary materials." Sarah's response carried the same measured tone she used for all interactions. "Lucky guess, but I've always been good with mechanical systems." Jennifer's eyes narrowed slightly as her military background triggered recognition of evasive responses designed to deflect further inquiry. 8 years of service had taught her to identify when someone was carefully avoiding direct answers about their qualifications or experience. Background verification revealed an intriguing gap in Sarah's employment history, nearly 4 years, where official records showed only vague references to independent consulting work that raised more questions than it answered for anyone who took the time to examine the timeline carefully. The consulting company listed as her primary reference existed, but their responses to verification requests were notably brief and uninformative. What none of them could see were the flashback moments that occasionally seized Sarah during quiet periods, fragments of memory involving aircraft that moved through hostile skies with precision that demanded everything a pilot could give. She carried knowledge of missions conducted in airspace where detection meant death, operations so classified that their existence remained buried in files that required security clearances most people would never possess. Her muscle memory retained the feel of flight controls under extreme stress, the subtle vibrations that indicated system failures, the split-second timing required to execute maneuvers that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. The weight of decisions made at altitudes where mistakes became casualties haunted her daily existence. Voices of squadron mates who had trusted her judgment, calling out from graves that bore names she could never speak aloud. She remembered each face from her unit, each shared moment of tension and triumph, each instance of dark humor that helped them cope with pressures that civilian life could never replicate. Their stories lived within her like sacred obligations that demanded honor through silence rather than recognition through revelation. As Sarah sat alone in the base cafeteria during lunch break, watching other contractors from social groups and share stories about their backgrounds, she felt the familiar weight of isolation that came with carrying secrets too important to share. The burden had grown heavier rather than lighter over the years, a constant reminder that some forms of service required complete sacrifice of personal connection and public acknowledgement. Little did she know that across the dining facility, a decorated pilot in civilian clothes was studying her with growing recognition. Colonel Patricia Hayes had been observing the contractor program as part of her duties overseeing civilian integration with classified aircraft systems. But something about the woman sitting alone was triggering memories from briefings she had attended years earlier. The face seemed familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten with the uncomfortable sensation of almost remembering something important. Her fingers drummed unconsciously against her coffee cup as she tried to place where she might have encountered that particular combination of features and bearing. Hayes possessed the kind of instincts that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments and 15 years of test pilot duties that regularly pushed experimental aircraft beyond their design limitations. Those same instincts were now telling her that Sarah Chun represented something more complex than a simple civilian contractor learning about military aviation systems. Meanwhile, the program's director, Major Robert Stevens, had begun his own informal assessment of the current group of participants. At 45, Stevens commanded respect through competence rather than bluster, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his position through demonstrated ability rather than political maneuvering. His career encompassed 2 decades of flying everything from basic trainers to cutting-edge prototype fighters, giving him perspectives on aviation that few people ever achieved. Stevens believed strongly in the value of civilian expertise in advancing military aviation. But he also maintained healthy skepticism about contractors who claimed capabilities they couldn't demonstrate under pressure. Interesting group this. Cycle, he commented to his deputy, Captain Lisa Park, as they reviewed participant files in his office overlooking the flight line. Most of them seemed genuinely excited to be here, but that Chun woman is hard to read. Captain Park nodded thoughtfully, her own background in intelligence analysis making her naturally observant about behavioral patterns that others might miss. She asks very specific questions during briefings, the kind that suggest more background knowledge than her file indicates. Almost like she's testing whether our information matches what she already knows. Stevens filed this observation away. For future reference, understanding that successful military aviation required constant evaluation of both equipment and personnel. People who possessed undisclosed qualifications could be either valuable assets or potential security risks, depending on their motivations and allegiances. The afternoon brought the group's first opportunity to observe actual flight operations. From the control tower, a privilege that required extensive security clearances and represented the kind of access that most civilians never experienced. Sarah stood at the observation windows with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the week, but her eyes tracked aircraft movements with intensity that suggested more than casual interest. When an F-22 Raptor executed a particularly complex landing pattern due to crosswind conditions, Sarah's subtle intake of breath was noticed by Marcus Williams, who had positioned himself nearby, hoping to strike up a conversation with someone who seemed to understand the technical aspects of what they were witnessing. "Impressive flying," he commented, expecting the kind of general agreement that most people offered when watching skilled pilots at work. The pilot corrected for wind shear at exactly the right moment, Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the aircraft. 3 seconds later, and that approach would have been unstable. Marcus stared at her in surprise, recognizing that her comment demonstrated an understanding of flight dynamics that went far beyond anything a computer systems specialist should possess. The timing and precision of her observation suggested someone who had either studied aviation extensively or possessed practical experience that her background didn't acknowledge. Sarah seemed to realize that her comment had revealed more knowledge than appropriate for her supposed role, because she immediately returned to her previous silence and moved away from further conversation. But the moment had been noticed by others in the group, adding another piece to the puzzle that was gradually forming around her true identity and qualifications. As the week concluded, whispered conversations among participants increasingly focused on the mystery that Sarah Chun represented. Her technical knowledge seemed too extensive for a civilian contractor, her reactions too precise for someone without flight training, her overall bearing too controlled for someone who had never faced the pressures that shaped military aviators. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating an atmosphere of curiosity and speculation that would only intensify as the program continued. And Sarah's carefully maintained cover faced increasingly sophisticated challenges to its credibility. Colonel Richard Blackwood arrived at Nellis Air Force Base on Monday morning carrying the weight of 30 years in military aviation and an ego that had grown with each promotion. At 52, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that filled rooms and demanded immediate attention. His silver hair perfectly groomed and his uniform pressed to standards that bordered on obsessiveness. His stride conveyed absolute confidence in his authority and his place within the rigid hierarchy that had shaped his entire adult identity. A third-generation Air Force officer, Blackwood represented everything traditional about military aviation culture. His grandfather had flown bombers over Europe during World War II. His father had commanded fighter squadrons during Vietnam, and Richard himself had built a career on the foundation of unquestioning respect for established order and conventional wisdom about who belonged in cockpits. His assignment to oversee the Advanced Avionics Integration Program represented what he privately considered beneath his qualifications, a bureaucratic posting that kept him away from real flying while preparing him for eventual retirement. The prospect of babysitting civilian contractors who thought they understood military aviation filled him with barely concealed resentment that colored every interaction. Civilians have their place in the defense industry, he often explained to subordinates during private conversations. But that place involves support roles, not anything requiring real understanding of what it means to be a warrior. Especially women contractors. They lack the physical and psychological makeup that defines effective military aviators. His views on gender in aviation remained firmly rooted in attitudes that younger officers increasingly questioned, but his rank and influence ensured that direct challenges to his opinions rarely occurred in professional settings. The old boy network that had facilitated his advancement shared similar perspectives, creating an echo chamber that reinforced rather than challenged his fundamental assumptions about capability and merit. During his first briefing with the current contractor group, Blackwood positioned himself at the front of the conference room with military precision, his eyes sweeping across the assembled participants with barely disguised assessment. His gaze lingered on Sarah Chun longer than the others, though not with recognition but rather with the kind of dismissive evaluation he reserved for people he considered fundamentally unsuited for serious aviation work. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance and respectful attention. "You are here because the Air Force occasionally requires civilian technical expertise. This does not make you pilots. This does not make you warriors. You are consultants in our domain, and you will conduct yourselves with appropriate recognition of your limitations." Sarah sat perfectly still in the second row, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts regarding Blackwood's opening remarks. But something in her controlled stillness seemed to irritate him in a way he couldn't immediately identify, and his eyes returned to her face with growing focus and unexplained annoyance. "Some of you may believe your civilian experience qualifies you to understand military aviation," Blackwood continued, his gaze now fixed directly on Sarah. "I assure you it does not. Flying military aircraft requires qualities that civilian training cannot instill, physical demands that civilian work cannot prepare you for, mental discipline that civilian environments cannot develop." Captain Park shifted uncomfortably in her seat at the back of the room, recognizing the colonel's tendency to turn routine briefings into lectures about civilian inadequacy. She had observed these sessions before and understood that Blackwood used them primarily to establish dominance rather than provide useful information to program participants. After the session concluded, Blackwood approached Sarah directly, his smile containing no warmth or genuine interest in her welfare. "Miss Chun, isn't it? I noticed you seemed particularly attentive during my remarks about civilian limitations in military aviation. Tell me, what's your background with aircraft systems?" "Computer integration primarily," Sarah replied simply, her voice betraying no emotion or defensive reaction to his obvious attempt at intimidation. "I work with avionics software and hardware compatibility issues." "I see. Computer work." Blackwood's tone made it clear that he considered such experience essentially worthless in the context of real aviation. "Well, I trust you understand that pushing buttons on a computer bears no resemblance to actually flying an aircraft under combat conditions. Different worlds entirely." Sarah met his gaze steadily without challenging his assumptions or attempting to defend her qualifications. "I understand that military aviation involves challenges that civilian work doesn't encounter." Something in her calm, measured response irritated Blackwood in ways that direct confrontation never could. Most contractors either showed nervous deference to his rank or defensive pride in their civilian accomplishments. Sarah's complete lack of emotional reaction to his deliberate provocations felt like indifference to his authority, which he interpreted as disrespect that required correction. "We'll see how well you handle those challenges," he said finally, making a mental note to monitor this particular contractor's performance closely. Her composure suggested either unusual professional discipline or dangerous overconfidence that needed to be addressed before it caused problems. As the days progressed, Blackwood began implementing his systematic campaign to establish proper boundaries almost immediately. Despite Sarah's consistent compliance with all program requirements, he assigned her the most tedious administrative tasks available: equipment inventory checks, maintenance log reviews, and documentation filing that other participants recognized as punishment rather than education. "Chun, you missed an entry on this maintenance report," he announced during a group session, pointing to paperwork that appeared complete to everyone else in the room. "Civilian attention to detail clearly isn't sufficient for military standards. Perhaps you should review your work more carefully before submitting it." Public humiliation became his preferred method of instruction, calling attention to her supposed shortcomings in front of the entire group while offering elaborate praise to others for identical or inferior performance. When Marcus Williams made the same type of minor error that had earned Sarah public criticism, Blackwood merely nodded approvingly and suggested minor improvements without the theatrical display of disappointment. Sarah endured each incident in complete silence, never defending herself or attempting to explain her actions to those who witnessed these exchanges. Her calm responses only seemed to fuel Blackwood's determination to break through what he perceived as stubborn defiance, masquerading as professionalism and appropriate respect for military hierarchy. Other participants quickly learned to follow the colonel's lead, understanding that associating with his chosen target could result in similar treatment for themselves. The group dynamic shifted as people who might naturally be friendly chose self-preservation over basic collegiality and mutual support. "I feel terrible about this," whispered Jennifer Blake to Marcus Williams during a coffee break. "But I can't afford to get on Blackwood's bad side. My company is bidding on a major contract next quarter, and his recommendation could make or break our chances." Marcus nodded grimly, his own military background making him recognize patterns of leadership abuse that he had hoped were becoming less common in modern service culture. "Guy's got serious control issues, but she's handling it better than most people would." That kind of composure under pressure isn't something you learn in civilian corporate environments. Social exclusion became the norm as conversations stopped. When Sarah approached and invitations to informal gatherings systematically failed to include her, whispered speculation followed her movements around the base, with people wondering what she might have done to earn such focused negative attention from someone of Blackwood's rank and reputation. The isolation compounded daily as individuals who might naturally offer friendship chose professional safety over human decency. Sarah accepted this treatment with the same stoic resignation she showed toward Blackwood's direct attacks, neither seeking allies nor expressing hurt at their absence from her daily experience. But Colonel Hayes continued observing from the periphery, her unease growing with each passing day as she watched the systematic harassment unfold. Something about Sarah's bearing under pressure, her responses to deliberate provocation, the way she carried herself during sustained abuse, it all felt disturbingly familiar to someone who had witnessed similar behavior under extreme circumstances. Late at night in her quarters, Hayes found herself accessing databases she rarely used, searching for connections she couldn't articulate clearly but felt increasingly certain existed somewhere in the classified records that documented military aviation history. The feeling of almost recognition continued to gnaw at her professional instincts. The technical assessments provided Blackwood with additional opportunities to demonstrate Sarah's supposed inadequacy. During simulator exercises designed to familiarize contractors with basic flight control interfaces, He consistently assigned her the most complex scenarios while providing minimal instruction and maximum criticism of her performance. Chun, your response time to that engine failure warning was completely inadequate, he announced during a group debrief, despite the fact that her reactions had been faster and more appropriate than most other participants. In a real aircraft, that kind of delay would result in catastrophic system failure. Perhaps civilian reflexes aren't suitable for military aviation emergencies. The other contractors exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing that Sarah's performance had actually been among the best in the group, but understanding that contradicting Blackwood's assessment would invite similar treatment for themselves. The colonel's arbitrary criticism created an atmosphere where merit became irrelevant compared to political considerations. Sarah's knowledge of aviation systems continued to surface despite her attempts to maintain a low profile. During briefings on advanced radar systems, she asked questions that demonstrated understanding of classified capabilities that civilian contractors shouldn't possess. When instructors discussed electronic warfare countermeasures, her subtle nods suggested familiarity with concepts that required extensive specialized training. "How did you know about frequency hopping protocols?" Captain Park asked after one particularly detailed technical session. "That information isn't included in any of our standard contractor materials." "I read extensively about communication systems," Sarah replied with the same measured tone she used for all deflections. "Technical journals, industry publications. It's part of staying current in my field." But Park's intelligence background made her skeptical of such convenient explanations, especially when they came from someone whose knowledge seemed too specific and too current to have been acquired through casual reading. The depth of Sarah's understanding suggested access to information that required security clearances and official briefings. Blackwood noticed these technical anomalies with growing suspicion that transformed his initial pleasure at having someone to dominate into genuine concern about what he might be dealing with. Her responses to his pressure tactics weren't breaking down as expected, and her knowledge base seemed inconsistent with everything her official background claimed. That evening, he began investigating her credentials more thoroughly, using his security clearance to access verification systems that should contain comprehensive information about anyone permitted on base. The results proved frustratingly incomplete, with significant gaps in her employment history and references that provided minimal detail about her actual qualifications and experience. "This doesn't add up," he muttered to his aide lieutenant, Colonel James Morrison, as they reviewed the search results on his office computer. "Civilian contractors don't have this level of background protection. There are classification restrictions here that I've never seen for someone without official military status." Morrison leaned over the screen, frowning at the access limitations that prevented deeper investigation into Sarah's background. "Sir, these security protocols suggest involvement with classified programs that require special handling." "Maybe. She worked on projects that can't be disclosed even to us." Blackwood's frustration mounted as every avenue of investigation led to dead ends or restricted information that required clearances above his authorization level. Sarah's calm responses to his increasingly aggressive harassment campaigns unsettled him in ways that simple defiance never could, suggesting reserves of strength and experience that made his own accomplishments feel suddenly inadequate. Late nights found him poring over personnel databases and security protocols, searching for clues about the woman who refused to break under pressure that had effectively controlled others in similar situations. But the more he searched, the more convinced he became that Sarah Chun was concealing something significant about her background and qualifications. The psychological pressure campaign intensified as Blackwood realized that conventional intimidation tactics were proving ineffective against someone whose responses suggested extensive training in handling stress and maintaining operational security under hostile conditions. Her professional demeanor never cracked, her performance never deteriorated, and her knowledge continued to exceed anything a civilian contractor should possess. The advanced flight simulation exercise was scheduled for Thursday morning, a complex scenario designed to test civilian contractors' understanding of multi-system failures under emergency conditions. Teams of 4 would be assigned different crisis situations involving critical aircraft malfunctions, then required to develop response protocols using their theoretical knowledge of military aviation systems. Most contractors approach the exercise with the nervous excitement of people about to play an elaborate video game with expensive equipment. Sarah's team found themselves assigned the most challenging scenario available: a catastrophic hydraulics failure in an F-22 Raptor at 30,000 feet with multiple system cascades, threatening total flight control loss, while her teammates, Jennifer, Blake, Marcus Williams, and David Chun, a propulsion specialist from a major aerospace contractor, huddled around technical manuals arguing about standard emergency procedures. Sarah sat quietly studying the scenario parameters with the intense focus of someone processing life or death information. Standard protocol calls for immediate descent to 15,000 feet, suggested David, reading directly from the emergency checklist provided to all teams. Then we follow the hydraulic failure flowchart step by step until we reach controlled flight. Conditions. That won't work, Sarah interrupted softly, her first substantial contribution to the team discussion. Rapid descent with compromised hydraulics will create control surface flutter that could tear the aircraft apart. The pilot needs to maintain current altitude while bleeding airspeed gradually through controlled turns. Marcus looked up from the technical specifications with growing amazement. How did you know that? The flutter calculations aren't in any of our reference materials. Sarah moved to the computer terminal, her fingers dancing across the flight control interface with practiced precision that suggested extensive familiarity with the system. Emergency power routing needs to go through the backup hydraulic accumulator. Here, then manual reversion for the primary flight controls. Communications should switch to UHF backup, frequency 243.0 to avoid interference from the damaged electrical systems. Her teammates stared at the solution she had developed with growing astonishment. The strategy accounted for variables that none of them had considered, anticipating cascading failures and proposing countermeasures that demonstrated encyclopedic knowledge of F-22 systems that weren't covered in any contractor orientation materials. "This is incredible," Jennifer whispered, studying the detailed emergency response plan that Sarah had outlined. "You've basically written a complete survival manual for this exact scenario. Where did you learn these things?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes that suggested the question had touched on memories she preferred to keep buried. "Flight simulation games, mostly. I've always been interested in aviation emergency procedures. It's just logical problem solving when you understand the underlying systems." But her teammates had noticed details that made them increasingly uncomfortable with her explanation. During the simulation, others had instinctively deferred to her guidance despite her official status as a computer system specialist. Her ability to coordinate multiple emergency responses simultaneously suggested experience that contradicted everything in her background file. When the exercise concluded and teams presented their solutions to the evaluation panel, Sarah's group earned perfect scores across all categories. Colonel Blackwood watched from the back of the room with obvious reluctance to acknowledge their success, his jaw tightening as he realized that his chosen target had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of military personnel with years of specialized training. "Interesting analysis, Miss Chun," Blackwood said slowly, his voice carrying new undercurrents of suspicion mixed with professional concern. "Your solution demonstrates familiarity with classified F-22 systems that aren't covered in any publicly available technical documentation. Where exactly did you acquire such detailed knowledge of emergency procedures?" "Research and analysis," Sarah replied simply, using the same measured tone that had become her standard response to all probing questions. "I believe in understanding the equipment I'm supposed to work with, so I study everything I can find about aircraft systems and emergency protocols." But the evaluation panel had noticed anomalies that raised serious questions about her claimed background. During the simulation, she had instinctively used military communication protocols and proper radio phraseology that civilian contractors rarely learned. Her ability to prioritize multiple system failures simultaneously suggested training that went far beyond theoretical knowledge. These inconsistencies began creating whispered conversations among participants who started questioning whether Sarah Chun represented exactly what she claimed to be. The level of expertise she had displayed seemed inconsistent with someone whose official experience involved only computer integration work for civilian aerospace companies. Blackwood noticed these technical revelations with growing alarm that transformed his campaign of harassment into genuine investigation about potential security violations. That evening, he convened an emergency meeting with Captain Park and Lieutenant Colonel Morrison to discuss his concerns about unauthorized access to classified information. "This woman knows things she shouldn't know," he stated flatly, pacing behind his desk while the others reviewed recordings of the simulation exercise. Her solution included procedures that are classified above the level that civilian contractors ever receive. Either someone violated security protocols to brief her, or she's not who she claims to be. Captain Park studied the technical analysis that Sarah had provided, recognizing elements that suggested access to information requiring special compartmented intelligence clearances. "Sir, some of these emergency procedures are so specialized that only test pilots and flight instructors receive this level of detail. Her knowledge base suggests either extensive military flight training or access to documentation that should be restricted." Morrison nodded grimly as he reviewed Sarah's personnel file on his tablet computer. "The background verification is starting to look increasingly suspicious. Her employment history has gaps that don't make sense, and her references are all from companies that provide minimal information about her actual work experience." Meanwhile, Colonel Hayes had been conducting her own investigation through very different channels, using her test pilot credentials to access databases that documented experimental flight programs and classified aviation projects. The facial recognition search she had quietly initiated was finally yielding results that made her blood run cold. The woman attending the contractor program as Sarah Chun bore an exact resemblance to someone whose classified service record included operations that most people would never know existed. Captain Alexandra Mitchell, according to the files Hayes was reading, had been one of the Air Force's most promising experimental test pilots before her career had ended abruptly under circumstances that remained heavily classified. "This can't be right," Hayes whispered to herself, studying photographs that showed identical facial features, down to a small scar near the left temple that appeared in both sets of images. The service record painted a picture of exceptional pilot skills, combined with innovative thinking that had made Mitchell invaluable for programs testing cutting-edge aircraft under extreme conditions. Her psychological evaluations described someone with extraordinary spatial reasoning and stress tolerance, qualities that made her perfect for missions where conventional approaches would fail catastrophically. But according to the official records, Captain Mitchell had been killed during a classified test flight 6 years earlier, when an experimental aircraft had suffered total system failure over restricted airspace. Hayes scrolled through after-action reports that detailed how the accident had occurred during trials of advanced stealth technology that pushed both aircraft and pilot beyond known performance envelopes. The investigation had concluded that equipment failure rather than pilot error had caused the crash, but the classified nature of the program meant that details remained buried in files that few people would ever access. The general stared at her computer screen for several minutes, processing the implications of what she had discovered. If Sarah Chun was indeed Alexandra Mitchell, then she was not just a skilled contractor, but a decorated test pilot whose supposed death had been fabricated for reasons that suggested ongoing classified operations requiring complete anonymity. Weight of this revelation settled over Hayes like a heavy blanket of responsibility and concern. Colonel Blackwood's harassment campaign wasn't just inappropriate. It was being directed at someone whose service record made his own accomplishments look conventional by comparison. If Mitchell had chosen to maintain her cover rather than reveal her true identity, there were probably compelling operational reasons for that decision. As Hayes prepared to secure the classified files, she wondered how long Sarah could maintain her anonymity under Blackwood's escalating pressure and investigation. More importantly, she wondered what would happen when the truth finally emerged in an environment where assumptions about capability and authority were about to be challenged by someone whose qualifications exceeded everyone else's expectations. Breakthrough came during a routine maintenance observation session, when the group was allowed to watch technicians servicing an F-16 Fighting Falcon that had recently returned from a training mission. Sarah stood with the other contractors at the designated safety line, but her eyes tracked the maintenance procedures with intensity that suggested more than academic interest. When one of the technicians encountered difficulty with a stubborn hydraulic connection, muttering about pressure bleeding problems that were preventing proper system reset, Sarah stepped forward with movements that seemed automatic rather than deliberate. "Excuse me," she said to the senior technician, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who was supervising the maintenance operation. "Have you tried bypassing the pressure accumulator through the auxiliary circuit? Sometimes trapped air in the main line prevents proper bleeding, but the auxiliary system can provide enough pressure differential to clear the blockage." Rodriguez stared at her in surprise, recognizing that her suggestion demonstrated an understanding of F-16 hydraulic systems that went far beyond anything a civilian contractor should possess. "Ma'am, that's not in the standard maintenance manual. How did you know about the auxiliary bypass procedure?" Sarah seemed to realize that she had revealed more knowledge than appropriate for her supposed role, because her expression tightened almost imperceptibly before she responded. "I've worked on similar hydraulic systems in civilian aircraft. The principles are generally the same across different platforms." But Rodriguez's 15 years of 1-6 maintenance experience told him that the specific procedure Sarah had suggested was unique to military aircraft and wasn't documented in a civilian technical literature. The auxiliary bypass she had described required knowledge of modifications that were classified and specific to Air Force operations. "Ma'am, with respect, that procedure is specific to military variants of this hydraulic system," Rodriguez said carefully, his eyes narrowing as he studied Sarah's face. "It's not something you'd encounter in civilian aviation, and it's not included in contractor orientation materials." The exchange was witnessed by several other participants, who began exchanging meaningful glances as they realized that Sarah had just demonstrated technical knowledge that contradicted her official background. Yet again, the pattern of expertise that exceeded her claimed qualifications was becoming impossible to ignore or explain through casual research and general interest. Marcus Williams approached Sarah after the maintenance session concluded, his expression mixing curiosity with growing concern about the inconsistencies he had been observing. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Your knowledge of these aircraft systems seems pretty extensive for someone who works primarily with computer integration. Have you had military training that's not in your official background?" Sarah's response carried the same careful neutrality. She maintained for all personal questions, but Marcus noticed the slight pause before she answered. "I've always been interested in aviation, so I study aircraft systems as a hobby. Technical documentation is available through various sources, if you know where to look." But Marcus's own military background made him skeptical of such convenient explanations. especially when they came from someone whose knowledge seemed too current and too specific to have been acquired through casual study. The depth of Sarah's understanding suggested access to information that required official briefings and hands-on experience. That evening, informal discussions among the contractors increasingly focused on the mystery that Sarah Chen represented. Her technical expertise seemed too extensive for a civilian, her responses too precise for someone without flight training, her overall demeanor too controlled for someone who had never faced the pressures that shaped military aviators. The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating an atmosphere of curiosity and speculation that was beginning to attract attention. From program supervisors who were trained to notice when security protocols might be compromised. The investigation that Blackwood had initiated was about to expand beyond his personal vendetta into a formal inquiry that could expose secrets that some people had risked everything to protect. The emergency alert klaxon shattered the peaceful Tuesday afternoon at Nellis Air Force Base, its piercing wail sending personnel scrambling across the tarmac as the base's speakers crackled to life with urgent announcements. Sarah Chen was reviewing technical specifications in the contractor study area when the first alarm sounded, but her immediate reaction told a story that her official background couldn't explain, while other contractors looked around in confusion. Trying to understand what the various alert codes meant, Sarah's body language shifted instantly into combat readiness. Her eyes automatically scanned for exits, her posture straightened with military precision, and her hands moved to secure loose items with the automatic efficiency of someone who had lived through actual emergencies rather than just read about them in safety manuals. All personnel maintain current positions, announced the base commander's voice over the intercom system. We have an aircraft emergency in progress. Runway operations are suspended until further notice. All non-essential personnel remain clear of flight operations areas. Through the study area windows, the contractors could see emergency vehicles racing toward the runway as fire trucks and ambulances positioned themselves for what appeared to be a serious aviation incident. Sarah moved to the window with controlled urgency that contrasted sharply with the nervous curiosity displayed by her colleagues. "What do you think happened?" Jennifer Blake asked, her voice tight with concern as she watched the emergency response unfold. "Aircraft in distress," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the runway activity. "Looks like they're preparing for an emergency landing. Heavy emergency response suggests major system failure or structural damage." Marcus Williams noticed the clinical precision of Sarah's assessment, recognizing that her evaluation of the situation demonstrated familiarity with emergency protocols that civilian contractors rarely possessed. "How can you tell it's that serious?" "All we can see are the fire trucks moving into position." Sarah pointed toward the crash rescue vehicles that were spreading foam across specific sections of the runway. Foam deployment pattern indicates they're expecting potential fuel spillage or fire risk. The positioning suggests the aircraft has limited maneuvering capability. This isn't a routine precautionary landing. Her analysis proved accurate when Colonel Hayes burst into the study area 15 minutes later, her flight suit indicating she had been pulled directly from active duty to handle the crisis. Her face carried the grim expression of someone dealing with a situation that could rapidly become catastrophic. "I need all contractors to evacuate this building immediately," Hayes announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "We have an F-22 Raptor with total hydraulic failure attempting an emergency landing. The pilot has limited control authority and may not be able to maintain a stable approach. This area is no longer safe." The contractors began gathering their materials with the nervous haste of people who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and dangerous. Sarah moved with them toward the exit, but her eyes remained fixed on the runway where a small speck in the distance was growing larger as it approached the base. Colonel Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his usual commanding presence replaced by barely controlled anxiety about an aviation emergency that threatened to become a major disaster. "Hayes, what's the status? Can the pilot maintain control long enough to reach the runway?" "Unknown," Hayes replied tersely, her attention divided between evacuating civilians and monitoring radio communications through her headset. "Captain Rodriguez has been fighting total hydraulic failure for the past 20 minutes. Primary and backup systems are completely offline. He's flying on manual reversion only, which means essentially no flight control assistance." Sarah stopped moving toward the exit as the implications of Hayes's words registered fully. Manual reversion in an F-22 meant the pilot was controlling a 65,000-pound aircraft through pure physical strength and aerodynamic knowledge, with no computer assistance and minimal control surface authority. It was a situation that even experienced test pilots rarely survived. "What are his landing options?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying new undertones of professional concern that caused both Hayes and Blackwood to look at her with surprise. Hayes studied Sarah's face for a moment, recognizing something in her expression that suggested more than civilian curiosity about the unfolding crisis. "Very limited. Manual reversion severely reduces control effectiveness. He's got maybe one chance to approach. And if he can't get the aircraft configured properly, there's no power for a go-around." Through the windows they could now see the F-22 in the distance, its normally graceful flight path replaced by subtle oscillations that indicated the pilot's struggle to maintain stable flight with compromised controls. The aircraft was approaching faster than normal landing speed, a clear indication that reduced control authority was forcing Captain Rodriguez to accept higher approach velocity to maintain adequate control response. "He's coming in too fast," Sarah observed, her voice carrying certainty that made Blackwood stare at her with growing suspicion. "At that speed, even if he reaches the runway, stopping distance will exceed available runway length. He needs to find a way to reduce approach speed while maintaining control authority." Colonel Hayes felt a chill of recognition as Sarah's assessment matched exactly what the tower controllers were reporting through her headset. The woman, supposedly trained in computer systems, was demonstrating understanding of high performance aircraft handling that suggested extensive flight experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "How would you reduce approach speed in manual reversion?" Hayes asked, testing her growing suspicions about Sarah's true background and qualifications. Sarah's response came without hesitation, delivered with the confident precision of someone who had faced similar emergencies. "Stern pattern to bleed energy while maintaining control effectiveness. Use aerodynamic drag from control surface deflection to reduce speed gradually. But timing has to be perfect. Too early and he loses control authority. Too late and he doesn't have enough runway to stop." The technical accuracy of Sarah's analysis sent shockwaves through both Hayes and Blackwood, who recognized that such knowledge could only come from extensive flight training and emergency procedures education that no civilian contractor should possess. Her understanding of manual reversion limitations and energy management suggested experience that contradicted everything in her official background. "Miss Chun," Blackwood said slowly, his voice carrying new undercurrents of suspicion mixed with growing alarm about potential security violations. "Your knowledge of F-22 emergency procedures seems remarkably detailed for someone whose background involves computer integration work. Perhaps you could explain how you acquired such specific expertise." Sarah's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly, as she realized that her concern for the pilot's safety had caused her to reveal knowledge that exposed her carefully maintained cover. The emergency unfolding outside had triggered automatic responses that belonged to someone with extensive military flight training rather than civilian technical experience. "I study aviation safety extensively," she replied, using the same measured tone that had become her standard deflection technique. Emergency procedures are fascinating from a systems analysis perspective. It's just logical problem solving when you understand the underlying physics. But Hayes was no longer buying such convenient explanations, especially when they came from someone whose technical assessments were proving more accurate than those of qualified military personnel. The depth of Sarah's understanding suggested access to information that required security clearances and official training rather than casual research. Through the radio chatter in her headset, Hayes could hear Captain Rodriguez's increasingly strained voice as he fought to maintain control of the damaged aircraft. "Tower, I'm having difficulty maintaining approach angle. Control response is degrading rapidly. I may not be able to execute the standard landing pattern." The tower controller's response carried professional calm despite the severity of the situation. "Roger, Raptor 77. You are cleared for any approach pattern that works. Emergency crews are standing by. Advise if you need to declare ejection intentions." Sarah moved closer to the window, her body language shifting into focused attention. That reminded Hayes uncomfortably of how experienced pilots behaved during critical flight operations. He's running out of options quickly. At the current rate of control degradation, he's got maybe 2 minutes before the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. 2 minutes? Blackwood demanded, staring at Sarah with growing alarm about how someone, with her supposed background, could make such precise assessments. How could you possibly calculate something that specific? Sarah seemed to realize that her analysis had revealed far more expertise than her cover story could explain, because her response carried new undertones of resignation about maintaining her anonymity. Control surface effectiveness degrades, predictably with hydraulic pressure loss. Once manual reversion authority drops below the minimum threshold, even the most skilled pilot can't maintain controlled flight. The accuracy of her technical knowledge was becoming impossible to ignore or explain through civilian education and general interest in aviation. Hayes watched Sarah's face carefully, recognizing subtle changes in expression that suggested someone preparing to abandon a long-maintained deception outside. The F-22 had begun executing the exact energy management pattern that Sarah had described, using gentle S-turns to reduce approach speed while maintaining control effectiveness. The maneuver demonstrated exceptional pilot skill, but everyone watching could see that the aircraft's flight path was becoming increasingly erratic as control authority continued degrading. "He's not going to make it," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying certainty that chilled everyone present. "Current approach angle and speed will result in runway overshoot even if he manages to touch down. He needs to execute an emergency approach pattern immediately or consider ejection while he still has aircraft control." Hayes keyed her radio microphone, relaying Sarah's assessment to the tower controllers who were managing the emergency. "Tower, recommend immediate emergency approach pattern. Current trajectory may result in runway overshoot." The response came back within seconds, confirming that Sarah's analysis matched what flight operations personnel were calculating using computer models and decades of experience. "Roger, we concur. Raptor 77, recommend immediate emergency approach. You are running out of runway margin." Captain Rodriguez's voice carried new strain as he acknowledged the recommendation. "Tower, attempting emergency approach now. Control authority is at minimum. This is going to be close." Sarah watched the F-22 begin its final approach with expression. That combined professional assessment with personal emotion that suggested deeper connection to the situation than civilian concern should explain. Her hands clenched involuntarily as the aircraft struggled to maintain a stable flight path, movements that reminded Hayes of how pilots unconsciously tried to help aircraft through difficult maneuvers. "He's fighting control surface flutter," Sarah observed, her voice tight with concentration. "Hydraulic accumulator pressure is insufficient to prevent aerodynamic forces from overpowering manual inputs. He's going to lose directional control within the next 30 seconds. The prediction proved accurate as the F-22's approach became increasingly unstable, with visible oscillations indicating that Captain Rodriguez was losing his battle against aerodynamic forces that were overwhelming the aircraft's remaining control authority. Everyone watching understood they were witnessing a situation that was rapidly approaching total loss of control. Colonel Blackwood stared at Sarah with growing recognition that her knowledge exceeded anything that could be explained by civilian background or casual interest in aviation. The woman standing beside him was demonstrating expertise that suggested extensive military flight training and emergency procedures education that no contractor orientation program could provide. "Miss Chun," he said carefully, his voice carrying new undertones of authority mixed with growing certainty about what he was dealing with. "I think it's time you explained exactly who you are and how you acquired knowledge that seems inconsistent with everything in your official background." Sarah turned from the window to face him, her expression carrying a new resolve that suggested the careful anonymity she had maintained was about to end. The emergency outside had forced her into revealing capabilities that her cover story couldn't explain, and the moment of truth that she had hoped to avoid was finally arriving. The F-22 Raptor's wings wobbled violently as Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio with increasing desperation. "Tower, I'm losing hydraulic pressure in the secondary system. Primary's already gone. I've got maybe 60 seconds before this bird becomes a lawn dart." Sarah Chun pressed closer to the window, her knuckles white against the glass as she watched the aircraft's increasingly erratic flight path. The subtle oscillations she had noticed earlier were becoming violent lurches that indicated complete loss of automated flight control systems. "He needs to configure for dead stick landing," she said quietly, her voice carrying technical precision that made Colonel Hayes turn sharply to stare at her. "But he's approaching too fast and too high. At the current energy state, he'll overshoot the runway even if he manages to get the aircraft on the ground." Colonel Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah's profile. "Miss Chun, your assessment of flight characteristics seems remarkably sophisticated for someone who works with computer systems. Perhaps you'd like to explain how you know so much about F-22 energy management." Before Sarah could respond, Captain Rodriguez's voice filled the room with barely controlled panic. "Tower, I'm declaring an emergency. Total hydraulic failure. Aircraft is becoming unresponsive to control inputs. I may need to punch out." The tower controller's response carried professional urgency. "Raptor 77, understand total hydraulic failure. You are cleared for immediate ejection if the aircraft becomes uncontrollable. Emergency crews are in position." Sarah moved away from the window with a sudden decision, her carefully maintained anonymity finally cracking under the pressure of watching a pilot face certain death. "Colonel Hayes, I need to speak with him directly. There's a chance, but it requires precise execution of procedures that aren't in standard emergency checklists." Hess stared at Sarah with growing amazement as subtle changes in posture and voice suggested someone with extensive aviation experience rather than civilian technical knowledge. "What procedures? And how would you know about techniques that aren't in standard checklists?" "Differential thrust vectoring combined with asymmetric control surface deflection," Sarah replied with clinical precision that belonged to someone with experimental test pilot experience. "It's not taught in conventional training, but it might provide enough control authority to execute emergency approaches." The technical sophistication of Sarah's proposal sent shock waves through both Hayes and Blackwood, who recognized that such knowledge could only come from classified test programs involving experimental flight techniques known to very few people in the entire military. "That technique is highly classified," Hayes said slowly, her voice carrying new undertones of recognition and growing certainty about what she was dealing with. "Only test pilots working with cutting-edge experimental programs would know about asymmetric thrust vectoring applications. Sarah's expression carried new resolve, as she abandoned the careful deflections that had protected her identity for months. "Colonel, there's no time for security protocols. Either let me help save that pilot's life, or watch him die because clearance levels are more important than survival." The stark choice crystallized the moment for Hayes, who understood that bureaucratic concerns about classified information were irrelevant when measured against preventing a pilot's death. She handed Sarah the radio microphone with movements that carried both professional trust and personal recognition of expertise that transcended official credentials. "Raptor 77, this is emergency flight consultation," Sarah said into the microphone, her voice carrying new authority that belonged to someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under extreme pressure. "I'm going to talk you through modified emergency procedures that might give you additional control options." Captain Rodriguez's response came back immediately, carrying desperate hope mixed with professional skepticism about unconventional guidance. "Emergency consultation. I'll try anything at this point. My control authority is degrading rapidly. What's the procedure?" Sarah's instructions flowed with practiced precision that demonstrated extensive experience with emergency techniques that weren't taught in standard pilot training. "Execute maximum asymmetric thrust. Left engine to military power, right engine to idle. This will create differential thrust that provides yaw control to compensate for lost rudder authority." The technical sophistication of Sarah's guidance sent Colonel Blackwood reaching for his secure communication device, understanding that he was witnessing someone whose knowledge exceeded anything that civilian contractors should possess. But his attention remained focused on the crisis unfolding outside, where the F-22 had begun responding to Sarah's instructions. "It's working," Captain Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying amazement as the aircraft's flight path began stabilizing. "I'm getting yaw control back. How did you know about asymmetric thrust techniques?" Sarah continued her guidance without answering the question, her focus entirely concentrated on helping the pilot navigate through procedures that required split-second timing and precise execution. "Now configured for energy management descent. Use speed brakes in conjunction with asymmetric thrust to control descent rate while maintaining adequate airspeed for control effectiveness." Through the window, everyone could see the F-22 executing exactly the maneuvers that Sarah was describing, with the aircraft's previously erratic flight path becoming increasingly stable as her unconventional techniques provided the control authority that Captain Rodriguez needed to maintain safe flight. "Emergency consultation. This is incredible," Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying professional admiration for expertise that was clearly saving his life. "Aircraft is responding better than it has since the hydraulic failure began. These procedures aren't in any manual I've ever seen." Colonel Hayes watched Sarah's profile as she continued providing guidance, recognizing subtle changes in posture and expression that suggested someone who had faced similar emergencies personally rather than just studied them academically. The confidence in her voice belonged to someone who had survived comparable situations through skill and knowledge, rather than theoretical understanding. "Begin approach pattern now," Sarah instructed, her voice carrying calm authority that belonged to someone accustomed to handling aviation emergencies. "Maintain asymmetric thrust configuration until you're over the runway threshold. Then reduce both engines to idle and allow aerodynamic braking to reduce speed." The F-22 began its final approach with stability that seemed miraculous compared to the uncontrolled flight path it had displayed just minutes earlier. Captain Rodriguez's voice carried new confidence as he reported successful execution of each procedure that Sarah had recommended. "Emergency consultation. I'm established on final approach. The aircraft is stable and responding to differential thrust inputs. I think I'm actually going to make it." Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the approaching aircraft, her expression carrying professional satisfaction, mixed with personal emotion that suggested deeper connection to the situation than Civilian concern should explain. Looking good for a touchdown. Trust the aircraft now. It will land itself if you don't over-control. The F-22 touched down on the runway with precision that would have been impressive under normal circumstances, but seemed miraculous given the total hydraulic failure that had threatened to make the aircraft uncontrollable. Emergency vehicles raced alongside as the aircraft rolled to a stop, but the landing had been executed with such skill that no emergency services were needed. "Emergency consultation. I'm down safe," Captain Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying gratitude and professional admiration that transcended normal pilot-to-controller communication. "That was absolutely incredible guidance. I need to know who I'm talking to." As the immediate crisis concluded, a crowd had gathered in the study area, drawn by word of the emergency and the mysterious civilian who had provided guidance that saved a pilot's life. Colonel Blackwood turned to face Sarah with an expression that combined professional curiosity with growing certainty about what he was dealing with. "Miss Chun," he said slowly, his voice carrying new undertones of authority mixed with grudging respect, "your knowledge of classified flight techniques just saved Captain Rodriguez's life. I think it's time we had a very serious conversation about exactly who you are." Sarah met his gaze steadily, understanding that her carefully maintained cover had been destroyed by her inability to watch a fellow pilot die when she possessed the knowledge to save him. The moment of truth she had hoped to avoid was finally arriving. "My name is Captain Alexandra Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice carrying new authority that belonged to someone whose true qualifications far exceeded anything her cover story had suggested. "I was a test pilot with the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base before my official death 6 years ago." The revelation sent shock waves through everyone present, but Colonel Hayes felt the pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly falling into place. Her own investigation had prepared her for this moment, but hearing the confirmation still carried emotional impact that transcended professional recognition. "Captain Mitchell," Hayes said formally, using Sarah's true rank for the first time, "your service record shows you were killed during a classified test flight accident. The official records indicate total aircraft loss with no survivors." "The official records serve operational security purposes," Sarah replied, her voice carrying characteristic directness that belonged to someone whose priorities had been shaped by experiences where appearance mattered less than substance. "My death was classified to protect ongoing test programs and prevent hostile intelligence services from targeting remaining experimental pilots." Colonel Blackwood stared at Sarah with growing recognition that his harassment campaign had been directed at someone whose service record made his own accomplishments look conventional by comparison. The systematic persecution he had inflicted on someone he had dismissed as an unqualified civilian contractor was about to be revealed as a catastrophic error in judgment. "You're telling me that for 6 weeks, I've been treating a decorated test pilot like she was some computer technician who didn't belong on a military base?" Blackwood asked, his voice carrying new undertones of professional horror at the scope of his mistake. "You were treating someone based on assumptions about gender and civilian status rather than actual capabilities," Sarah replied without emotion or accusation. "The same assumptions that led to my initial rejection from pilot training, despite test scores that exceeded most accepted candidates." The transformation in how everyone viewed Sarah was immediate and complete. Military personnel who had witnessed the emergency response began approaching with expressions of respect and professional admiration that acknowledged her true qualifications, rather than her cover story. Jennifer Blake pushed through the crowd, her expression mixing shame with amazement as she realized the implications of what had been revealed. "Sarah. Captain Mitchell, we all just watched you save a pilot's life, and we spent weeks treating you like you didn't belong here." Marcus Williams nodded grimly, his own military background making him understand the full scope of what had occurred. 6 weeks of harassment directed at someone whose qualifications exceeded everyone else's combined. This is going to change everything. But Sarah remained unmoved by either the previous persecution or the current recognition, her expression suggesting that external validation had ceased to matter to someone who measured worth by different standards than rank or official acknowledgement. "I didn't reveal my identity to gain respect," she explained to the assembled group that continued growing as word of the emergency spread. "I revealed it because watching a pilot die when I had the knowledge to save him would have been a betrayal of everything military aviation represents." As emergency personnel completed their response procedures and Captain Rodriguez safely exited his aircraft, the base began processing the implications of what had occurred. The woman who had been systematically harassed for her supposed civilian limitations had revealed herself as one of the Air Force's most skilled pilots, whose classified service record included achievements that most people would never know existed. The briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base had never hosted a session quite like this one. Within 2 hours of the emergency landing, senior officers from across the installation had assembled to understand how a civilian contractor had possessed the classified knowledge necessary to save an F-22 pilot's life. The atmosphere crackled with tension as careers, reputations, and institutional assumptions faced unprecedented scrutiny. Captain Alexandra Mitchell sat at the head of the conference table with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout her weeks of harassment, but now her true identity had transformed how everyone in the room perceived her presence. The woman they had known as Sarah Chun had become someone whose service record commanded respect that transcended rank and protocol. General Patricia Morrison, Nellis Air Force Base commander, entered the room with the measured stride of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. At 58, she possessed the kind of authoritative presence that came from 3 decades of military service, and the wisdom to recognize when institutional failures required immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the events of this afternoon would have consequences extending far beyond a single emergency. "We're here to understand how Captain Mitchell's expertise became available to save Captain Rodriguez's life, and why her true identity wasn't recognized during her participation in the contractor program." Colonel Hayes shifted uncomfortably in her seat, knowing that her own investigation had uncovered Mitchell's true identity but hadn't been acted upon quickly enough to prevent the harassment campaign that had targeted a decorated war hero. "General, I had suspected Captain Mitchell's true identity for several days, but was waiting for confirmation through official channels before taking action." "Suspected based on what evidence?" Morrison asked, her tone carrying professional interest rather than accusation. "Facial recognition matches with classified personnel files," Hayes replied, producing a tablet that displayed side-by-side photographs showing identical features. "Captain Mitchell's supposed death 6 years ago was classified at levels that required special verification procedures. I was working through proper channels to confirm her identity." General Morrison studied the photographs with growing recognition of the security implications involved. "Captain Mitchell, perhaps you could explain why someone with your qualifications chose to participate in a civilian contractor program under an assumed identity." Mitchell's response carried the same measured tone that had characterized all her interactions during the program. "Generally, I needed to assess whether institutional attitudes toward female pilots had evolved since my original rejection from flight training. The contractor program provided an opportunity to observe current military culture without the complications that my service record might create." The admission sent ripples of uncomfortable recognition through the assembled officers, who began understanding that they had been unknowingly participating in an evaluation of their own prejudices and assumptions about capability and gender. In military aviation, Colonel Blackwood sat rigid in his chair, his face pale with the growing realization that his harassment campaign had been directed at someone whose qualifications made his own career accomplishments appear routine by comparison. The systematic persecution he had inflicted on Mitchell would now be scrutinized by superiors who understood the full scope of his error. "Colonel Blackwood," Morrison said, her voice carrying new undertones of authority that made everyone in the room understand that accountability was about to be demanded. "Your treatment of Captain Mitchell during her participation in the program requires explanation. What justified the harassment campaign that multiple witnesses have reported?" Blackwood's voice carried defensive uncertainty as he attempted to explain actions that now appeared indefensible. "Generally, I was attempting to maintain appropriate discipline and standards." Her background appeared inconsistent with the knowledge she demonstrated, and I suspected potential security violations. "So your response to suspected security violations was systematic harassment rather than proper investigation through official channels?" Morrison's tone made it clear that she considered his explanation inadequate. I believe that civilian contractors needed to understand their place in the military hierarchy," Blackwood replied, his voice growing weaker as he realized how his actions appeared when subjected to command scrutiny. Captain Rodriguez had been invited to participate in the debriefing as the pilot whose life had been saved by Mitchell's intervention. His presence served as a stark reminder that the harassment campaign had targeted someone whose knowledge and skills were genuinely exceptional rather than merely claimed. "General," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying professional gratitude mixed with anger at how Mitchell had been treated. "Captain Mitchell's guidance saved my life through techniques that I've never encountered in standard training. Her knowledge of emergency procedures exceeded anything I learned in test pilot school." The testimony reinforced Morrison's growing understanding that the harassment campaign had been directed at someone whose expertise could have benefited the entire program if it had been recognized and utilized properly rather than suppressed. Through systematic persecution, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Blackwood's aide, had been reviewing personnel files and security protocols to understand how Mitchell's true identity had remained hidden for so long. His findings painted a disturbing picture of institutional failures that extended beyond individual prejudice. Generally, the background verification process for civilian contractors appears to have significant gaps, Morrison reported, displaying classification levels that had prevented proper identity confirmation. Captain Mitchell's cover identity was protected by security protocols that prevented normal verification procedures, meaning that Colonel Blackwood's suspicions about her background were actually correct, but his response was completely inappropriate. Morrison asked, her tone carrying implications that everyone understood would affect career prospects and future assignments. "Yes, ma'am." The proper response would have been to request higher-level security investigation rather than personal harassment, Morrison confirmed, his analysis making Blackwood's errors appear even more serious. The contractor program participants had been invited to provide testimony about their observations during Mitchell's participation, creating an opportunity for them to confront their own failures to support someone who had been systematically targeted. Jennifer Blake spoke first, her voice carrying shame at her own complicity in the harassment campaign. "General, we all noticed that Captain Mitchell's knowledge exceeded what her background suggested, but we chose to avoid association with her rather than question Colonel Blackwood's treatment of her." Marcus Williams nodded grimly, his military background making him understand the full scope of what had occurred. "We witnessed systematic harassment of someone whose qualifications exceeded everyone else's, but we prioritized our own career protection over basic human decency." The testimony created an uncomfortable reckoning for everyone who had participated in or witnessed the harassment campaign, forcing them to confront the difference between following orders and enabling injustice through passive complicity. "General." Morrison's expression grew increasingly serious as the full scope of institutional failures became clear. "So we have a decorated test pilot whose expertise could have enhanced the entire program. but instead she was subjected to harassment that prevented her knowledge from being utilized effectively. "General, there's another issue," Colonel Hayes interjected, producing additional classified files that detailed Mitchell's actual service record. Captain Mitchell's test pilot experience includes experimental programs that could revolutionize military aviation training. Her knowledge represents institutional assets that we've been wasting through prejudice and poor leadership. The revelation that Mitchell's expertise extended far beyond emergency procedures created new understanding of what the harassment campaign had cost in terms of lost opportunities for institutional improvement and advancement, Captain Mitchell. Morrison said, turning to address her directly. "Your service record indicates involvement with classified programs that could benefit current training protocols. Are you willing to share that knowledge despite the treatment you've received?" Mitchell's response carried characteristic directness that belonged to someone whose priorities had been shaped by experiences where substance mattered more than recognition. "Generally, I came here to assess whether the institution had evolved enough to utilize capabilities regardless of gender or conventional expectations. Today's events suggest that change is possible, but requires leadership that values competence over comfort." The assessment created uncomfortable recognition among the assembled officers, who understood that they were being evaluated by someone whose qualifications exceeded their own and whose judgment about institutional culture carried weight that transcended rank. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the maintenance technician who had witnessed Mitchell's knowledge of hydraulic systems, had been invited to provide testimony about her technical expertise. His observations reinforced the growing understanding that her capabilities extended across multiple areas of aviation knowledge. "General, Captain Mitchell's understanding of F-16 hydraulic systems was more detailed than anything I've encountered in 15 years of maintenance work," Rodriguez reported. Her knowledge wasn't theoretical, it was practical experience that suggested hands-on familiarity with systems that civilian contractors shouldn't have access to. The testimony added another layer to the growing recognition that Mitchell's expertise represented genuine institutional assets that had been wasted through prejudice and poor judgment rather than utilized for program. IMPROVEMENT, Dr. Elena Vasquez, the program civilian education coordinator, had observed Mitchell's interactions with other participants and recognized patterns that suggested extensive leadership experience. Her assessment provided additional context for understanding what the harassment campaign had cost in terms of lost educational opportunities. "General, Captain Mitchell's approach to problem-solving and team coordination suggested command experience that could have enhanced the entire program," Vasquez reported. Her ability to synthesize complex information and provide clear guidance exceeded what we typically see from participants with traditional military backgrounds. The testimony reinforced Morrison's growing understanding that the institutional failures extended beyond individual harassment to encompass systematic waste of human resources and expertise that could have benefited everyone involved. Captain Park, who had been assisting with program administration, had documented multiple instances where Mitchell's knowledge could have improved training protocols if it had been recognized and utilized properly rather than suppressed through systematic persecution. "General, Captain Mitchell identified several areas where current training materials could be enhanced through incorporation of advanced techniques," Park reported. Her suggestions could have improved emergency preparedness for all program participants, but they were dismissed due to assumptions about her background. The documentation created clear evidence that the harassment campaign had cost the program valuable opportunities for improvement and advancement, demonstrating that prejudice and poor leadership had institutional consequences that extended beyond individual treatment. General Morrison's expression reflected growing determination to address the institutional failures that had been revealed through the day's events. "It appears that we have systematically wasted exceptional expertise through prejudice and poor judgment," This represents not just personal injustice, but institutional failure that requires immediate correction. The assessment carried implications that everyone understood would affect future policies, leadership assignments, and cultural expectations throughout the installation. The woman who had been harassed for her supposed civilian limitations had revealed institutional failures that demanded comprehensive response. As the debriefing continued, the scope of necessary changes became increasingly clear. The harassment campaign had exposed problems that extended far beyond individual prejudice to encompass systematic failures in leadership, security procedures, and institutional culture that required sustained attention and genuine reform. 3. Years after the emergency landing that changed everything, the Advanced Aviation Training Center at Nellis Air Force Base had become the most sought-after assignment in military aviation education. The facility bore little resemblance to the contractor orientation program that had once operated within its walls, having been transformed into a comprehensive training institute that attracted pilots, engineers, and aviation specialists from across the globe. Captain Alexandra Mitchell stood before a classroom filled with the Air Force's most promising pilots, her presence commanding respect that transcended rank or protocol. At 31, she had evolved from a hidden test pilot maintaining cover identity into one of the military's most influential aviation educators, whose methods were reshaping how the institution approached pilot training and emergency preparedness. Today, we're going to discuss asymmetric thrust vectoring during total hydraulic failure, Mitchell announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose expertise had been proven under the most demanding circumstances. Not because it's in your manual, but because someday it might save your life when your manual becomes irrelevant. The students leaned forward with intense attention that belonged to people who understood they were receiving knowledge that couldn't be found in textbooks or conventional training programs. Mitchell's reputation had spread throughout military aviation circles, attracting students who specifically requested assignments to her courses. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a recent graduate from pilot training, raised her hand with the respectful curiosity that Mitchell's teaching methods encouraged. "Captain, how do you determine when unconventional techniques are worth the risk compared to standard emergency procedures?" Mitchell's response demonstrated the kind of practical wisdom that could only come from someone who had faced genuine emergencies where textbook solutions proved inadequate. "Lieutenant, standard procedures exist because they work in most situations. But most situations isn't good enough when you're the pilot facing the exception. Your job is to understand systems deeply enough to improvise solutions when conventional approaches fail." The teaching philosophy represented a fundamental shift from traditional military aviation education, which had historically emphasized rigid adherence to established procedures over creative problem-solving and individual initiative. Mitchell's approach produced pilots who could think independently while maintaining the discipline necessary for safe flight operations. Colonel Patricia Hayes, now serving as Director of Aviation Education, observed Mitchell's classes regularly to understand how her methods achieved consistently superior results. Compared to traditional training approaches, the transformation in student performance had attracted attention from military leaders who were seeking ways to improve pilot training across all services. "She's revolutionized how we think about emergency preparedness," Hayes explained to a group of visiting officers from other bases. "Her students don't just memorize procedures, they understand underlying principles that allow them to adapt when circumstances exceed standard protocols." The success of Mitchell's methods had created demand for her training techniques throughout the military aviation community. Bases across the country were implementing modified versions of her curriculum, while senior officers sought her consultation on improving pilot training and emergency response protocols. Major Robert Stevens, who had served as the original contractor program director, had been promoted to oversee the expanded training facility. His transformation from skeptical administrator to enthusiastic advocate for Mitchell's methods illustrated how institutional culture could evolve when confronted with undeniable evidence of superior approaches. Captain Mitchell's impact extends far beyond individual pilot training, Stevens reported during a quarterly review with senior command. Her methods have reduced emergency incidents by 40% among graduates, while improving overall pilot confidence and competence in handling unexpected situations. The statistical evidence supported broader implementation of Mitchell's techniques, but more importantly, it demonstrated that institutional change could occur when leadership was willing to embrace innovation over tradition and competence over comfortable assumptions about established methods. Captain Rodriguez, whose life had been saved by Mitchell's intervention, had become one of her most effective advocates within the pilot community. His first-hand experience with her expertise provided credibility that transcended rank or official endorsement, making him a powerful voice for expanding her influence. "She saved my life with knowledge that wasn't in any manual," Rodriguez told a gathering of senior pilots from across the Air Force. But more than that, she's teaching the next generation to think beyond procedures and understand aircraft systems at a level that makes them genuinely safer pilots. The testimony from someone who had survived an emergency through Mitchell's guidance carried weight that no amount of theoretical discussion could achieve, demonstrating that her expertise represented practical capabilities rather than academic knowledge. The transformation extended beyond technical training to encompass broader changes in military aviation culture. Mitchell's experience with systematic harassment had led to comprehensive reforms in how the military addressed gender discrimination and evaluated personnel based on capability rather than assumptions about traditional roles. General Patricia Morrison, whose investigation had exposed the institutional failures surrounding Mitchell's treatment, had implemented service-wide changes in leadership training and personnel evaluation. The reforms specifically addressed the kind of prejudice-based harassment that had targeted Mitchell while establishing clear consequences for leaders who allowed such behavior to persist. The Mitchell incident revealed systemic problems that extended far beyond individual prejudice, Morrison explained during a presentation to Joint Service Leadership. "We've implemented comprehensive reforms that emphasize merit-based evaluation and zero tolerance for discrimination that undermines operational effectiveness." The policy changes had created measurable improvements in retention rates among female pilots and increased reporting of discrimination incidents, suggesting that institutional culture was evolving in response to clear leadership commitment to change rather than merely procedural adjustments. Jennifer Blake, the former contractor who had witnessed Mitchell's harassment, had become a vocal advocate for workplace equality in defense contracting. Her transformation from passive bystander to active reformer illustrated how individual experiences could catalyze broader social change when people chose courage over comfort. Watching Captain Mitchell endure systematic harassment while possessing extraordinary expertise taught me that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, Blake explained during a conference on workplace equality. "We all have a responsibility to speak up when we witness discrimination, regardless of the personal cost." The advocacy work had led to industry-wide changes in how defense contractors addressed workplace discrimination, while establishing support networks for people who faced similar challenges in male-dominated technical fields. Marcus Williams had leveraged his own military experience to become a consultant on leadership development and organizational culture. His work focused on helping institutions recognize and utilize talent regardless of traditional assumptions about background or qualifications. The Mitchell case taught us that our assumptions about capability often prevent us from recognizing genuine expertise, Williams explained to corporate executives attending a leadership development seminar. Effective organizations create environments where merit is recognized regardless of whether it comes in expected packaging. The consulting work had expanded beyond military context to encompass civilian organizations. seeking to improve their ability to identify and develop talent while eliminating discrimination that prevented optimal utilization of human resources. Colonel Blackwood's career had effectively ended not through formal disciplinary action, but through the weight of his own actions becoming visible to superiors, who understood that his judgment could not be trusted with important responsibilities. His reassignment to administrative duties represented institutional recognition that leadership required wisdom rather than merely authority. The transformation in his circumstances served as a powerful example for other officers who might be tempted to allow personal prejudices to influence their treatment of subordinates or colleagues. The message was clear: discrimination would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or seniority. Dr. Elena Vasquez had expanded her research on military education to encompass broader questions about how institutions could better identify and develop exceptional talent. Her work had influenced training programs across multiple services, while establishing new standards for evaluating educational effectiveness. Captain Mitchell's experience demonstrates that institutional excellence requires constant vigilance against prejudice and assumption. Vasquez explained in a research paper that had become required reading for military education specialists. Our ability to recognize and utilize exceptional capability determines our effectiveness as an institution. The research had contributed to fundamental changes in how military education programs were designed and evaluated, with increased emphasis on outcomes rather than traditional metrics that might not reflect actual capability or potential. The memorial service for test pilots who had died during classified operations had become an annual tradition at the training center, honoring those whose sacrifice remained largely unknown to the public. Mitchell's presence at these ceremonies represented continuity between past sacrifice and current commitment to excellence. We remember not just their deaths, but their dedication to pushing the boundaries of what's possible, Mitchell said during the most recent memorial service. Their sacrifice demands that we continue pursuing excellence while ensuring that institutional failures don't waste the capabilities of those who serve. The ceremonies provided opportunities for reflection on the relationship between individual sacrifice and institutional responsibility, reinforcing the connection between personal integrity and organizational effectiveness. Captain Kim, who had become one of Mitchell's most successful students, represented the next generation of pilots who would carry forward the lessons learned from institutional transformation. Her confidence and competence demonstrated that change was possible when leadership was committed to excellence over comfort. Captain Mitchell taught me that being a pilot means more than following procedures, Kim explained to a group of junior officers. It means understanding systems deeply enough to solve problems that no one has encountered before, while maintaining the humility to learn from anyone who has knowledge worth sharing. The perspective represented a fundamental shift in military aviation culture, where individual initiative was valued alongside institutional discipline, and where learning was viewed as a continuous process rather than a finite achievement. The Advanced Aviation Training Center had become a model for military education institutions worldwide, demonstrating that transformation was possible when leaders were willing to embrace change rather than defend tradition. Mitchell's influence had created ripple effects that extended far beyond individual pilot training to encompass broader questions about organizational effectiveness and cultural evolution. As Mitchell prepared for her next assignment, developing training programs for experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of current technology, she reflected on how her initial rejection from pilot training had ultimately led to contributions that exceeded anything she might have achieved through conventional career paths. The woman who had been denied pilot training had revolutionized how pilots were trained, proving that excellence often emerges from unexpected sources when institutions are wise enough to recognize and nurture genuine capability. Her legacy would continue through the pilots she had trained, the reforms she had catalyzed, and the cultural transformation she had helped create. The story of Captain Alexandra Mitchell demonstrated that individual integrity could indeed transform institutions, that refusing to accept limitations could create opportunities for others, and that genuine excellence spoke louder than tradition, while lasting longer than comfortable assumptions about who possessed the capabilities that mattered most. Sometimes the greatest achievements came not from following expected paths, but from having the courage to challenge systems that wasted human potential through prejudice and assumption. Mitchell's journey from rejected candidate to transformational leader proved that institutional excellence required constant vigilance against complacency and continuous commitment to recognizing capability wherever it might be found. The woman, who had been denied pilot training, had ultimately taught the entire military aviation community what it truly meant to fly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.